Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Shabbat Chaverim. Thank you so much for coming back and joining me this afternoon. I greatly appreciated it. Appreciate it. Those of you who were here for services this morning know that we read a very interesting Torah portion, Kitisa, and discussed it a bit. And this afternoon, I'm going to go back to what I have been teaching about the last couple of weeks on both my Chai There with Rabbi Leah program as well as Shabbat Chaverim. And that is this set of holidays that begins in the spring after the set of holidays that actually begins with Purim and goes all the way through up until April and some into May. And this whole set of holidays, which come one right after the other, it's a pretty intense time, although maybe not quite as intense as a rabbi would experience during the holidays in the fall. However, there are many different days. We've discussed several of them already, and just as a brief review, we discussed Yom HaShoah, the day of remembrance for the Holocaust, Holocaust Memorial Day. We discussed Yom HaZikaron, the Memorial Day for soldiers in Israel who have perished, as well as those who have died at the hands of terrorist acts. And we talked about Yom HaAtzmaut, the day of joyful celebration for the founding of the State of Israel. And this year, we will be observing, let's see, 1948 to 2022 is 52 and 22. This will be the 74th anniversary of the State of Israel. I should have known that off the top of my head. But I just wanted to challenge myself to see if I could still do the math without having to write the figures down. And I guess I could. So next year, Yom HaAtzmaut, of course, will be a really big celebration on the 75th anniversary. As I mentioned at the end of my discussion with you last time about Yom HaAtzmaut, it is a very big celebration. However, for two very disparate groups, it's also a difficult day. The first, of course, is for many of the Palestinians who see Independence Day as a day of catastrophe for them. And they call it the Nakba, which really means catastrophe. The other group is for many of the ultra-religious Jews in Israel. They see Yom HaAtzmaut, Independence Day, as a day that is not celebrated because, according to the scripture, the modern state of Israel is anathema to the biblical prophecy about the coming of the Mashiach. And because of this modern state that according to many of the ultra Orthodox, this could be seen as something that actually diverges from the story of how the Mashiach, the Messiah, will come, and therefore is getting in the way of and perhaps delaying that appearance of the Messiah. So those are kind of tangential subjects that we could talk about at another time, but for now, just know that although it is for the most part, a major celebration in the state of Israel, with offices closed, with lots of celebration, with fireworks and everything you'd expect to see, with barbecues and picnics and parades and ceremonies also at cemeteries, and special programming on TV and radio dedicated specifically to the day. It is not celebrated by 100% of Israelis. There are those for whom it is a very difficult day and not a day of celebration. Okay, now I want to move on to the last of the non-religiously based holidays. In other words, those that are these holidays, this clump of holidays that we've been looking at, and not all holidays, but observances and holidays, are those that came about as a result of the modern state of Israel. So these are not biblical in nature. Yom HaShoah, certainly, which came about in the late 40s and finally in the early 50s, declared by the government to be a specific day dedicated to the remembrance of the Holocaust. Yom HaZikaron, the memorial for soldiers killed in wars and those killed in terrorist acts. Yom HaAtzmaut, the celebration of the independence of Israel. Of course, these are all secular holidays and not biblical in nature. And now we come to the fourth one, also a day of, for the most part, joyous celebration, and that is Yom Yerushalayim. It is a national holiday, and it's an Israeli national holiday commemorating the reunification of Jerusalem and the establishment of Israeli control over the old city of Jerusalem in the aftermath of the June 1967 Six-Day War. And the day is officially marked by state ceremonies and memorial services and so on. The chief rabbinate of Israel declared Jerusalem Day a minor religious holiday to mark the regaining of access to the Western Wall. So for 2,000 years, Jerusalem was not unified. For 2,000 years, Yerushalayim was not the provenance of the Israelis, and so it is a significant observance. And the reason that the chief rabbinate of Israel has declared Jerusalem Day a minor religious holiday, meaning that, you know, there are some minor work stoppages, there's no fasting, of course, but because it marks the regaining of access to the Western Wall being the last remaining large remnant of the temple in Jerusalem that was destroyed in 70 CE by the Romans. And so access was regained to the wall in Jerusalem. And of course, the Western Wall, the Kotel, is seen by many Jews as the most significant, most religiously significant piece of architecture that remains in the state of Israel, that reminds us of God's temple, because of course this is the temple in which God dwelled. So under the 1947 United Nations Partition Plan for Palestine, they proposed an establishment of two states. Sound familiar? In British Mandatory Palestine, there would be a Jewish state and an Arab state, and Jerusalem was supposed to be an international city. But of course, after the declaration of the State of Israel on May 15th of 1948, Jerusalem was attacked by its Arab neighbors. Jordan seized East Jerusalem and the Old City, and Israeli forces made a concerted attempt to dislodge them, but were unable to do so. So by the end of 1948, Arab-Israeli war, in that war, Jerusalem was left divided between Israel and Jordan. And the old city in East Jerusalem continued to be occupied by Jordan, and Jewish residents were forced out. And under Jordanian rule, half of the old city's 58 synagogues were demolished, and the Jewish cemetery on the Mount of Olives, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, was plundered for its tombstones. And those tombstones were used as paving stones and building materials. Talk about a desecration to use tombstones, Jewish tombstones, for such a purpose. But this all changed in 1967 as a result of the Six-Day War. And before the start of that war, Israel sent a message to King Hussein of Jordan saying Israel would not attack Jerusalem or the West Bank as long as the Jordanian front remained quiet. And so, urged by Egyptian pressure and based on deceptive intelligence reports, Jordan began shelling civilian locations in Israel. Israel, of course, responded on the 6th of June by opening up the Eastern Front, and on the following day, the 7th of June, 1967, Israel recaptured the old city of Jerusalem. And there is an iconic photograph showing, I'm going to make a mistake here, it's either 3 or 4 Israeli IDF members, Israel Defense Force members, with their faces all looking in the same direction up and the wall behind them. And that scene was recently reenacted by the same 4 IDF members. It was quite a thing to see how they had aged since 1967. So, of course, we do everything on Jewish time in Israel. And it just so happened that the 7th of June, 1967, corresponded to the 28th of the year of ER in 5727. That was when Israel recaptured the old city of Jerusalem. And later that day, the defense minister, Moshe Dayan, declared something which is often repeated on Yom Yerushalayim today. And he said the following: this morning, the Israel Defense Forces liberated Jerusalem. We have united Jerusalem, the divided capital of Israel. We have returned to the holiest of our holy places, never to part from it again. To our Arab neighbors, we extend also at this hour, and with added emphasis at this hour, our hand in peace. And to our Christian and Muslim fellow citizens, we solemnly promise full religious freedom and rights. We did not come to Jerusalem for the sake of other people's holy places and not to interfere with the adherents of other faiths, but in order to safeguard its entirety and to live there together with others in unity. And boy, oh boy, when we read his words today, knowing what has transpired in Jerusalem, knowing the kinds of things that have taken place in the streets of Jerusalem, knowing what has taken place at the Kotel, in the holy spaces surrounding the Kotel, would only his words have come true. It would have been wonderful, but unfortunately they didn't. And something that we are still grappling with today has to do with religious and gender equality at the wall in Jerusalem. For any of you who have been there in recent years, you know that there has been a marked expansion of the area in front of the wall where those who wish to go and pay a visit can stand. However, the area where the men stand has increased in size dramatically. The area where the women stand has decreased in size dramatically. It is not that long ago. In fact, about I'm trying to remember if it's 6 or 7 years ago. It wasn't on my last trip to Israel, but the one before that, that the Women of the Wall, which started several decades ago as a small group of women who went to the wall every Rosh Chodesh at the beginning of each new month to pray, to worship, to sing and dance and read the Torah. and who have been spit on, who have had objects thrown at them, who have been screamed at. And by the way, this is not just a group of women, there are men that join them as well. This is an egalitarian group, and unfortunately, the wall, which should be for everybody, has been relegated into the control of the Israeli rabbinate, which has come down severely on this group. Women have been arrested, women have been hauled away by the police in handcuffs, Torah scrolls have been torn from their arms. Those who are not ultra-Orthodox, who wish to celebrate a bar or a bat mitzvah at the Kotel, have to go around to the side, to the southern steps, to a rickety balcony that is somewhat difficult to get onto. I know because I've actually officiated at some B'nai Mitzvah there, and even though Netanyahu's government promised a 10,000 square foot area that would be dedicated to egalitarian groups, groups of men and women who could worship together, it never came to fruition because of politics, because Netanyahu's government was so beholden to the ultra-Orthodox for their support of him and his cabinet that he reneged on promises made, and still to this day, this 10,000 square foot plaza has yet to be constructed. So Jerusalem is back in the hands of Israel. The wall is back in the hands of Israel. The war ended with a ceasefire on the 11th of June, 1967, lasted 6 days, and still we don't see full and complete satisfaction for all Jews who wish to pray at the wall. So there are, the 50th anniversary, of course, was marked a number of years ago. That was in 2017. It was the Golden Jubilee of Yerushalayim Day. There were many, many celebrations that took place throughout the entire year leading up to it. And there are still celebrations to this day that take place. People gather at the Kotel. Religious Zionists will recite special holiday prayers. They will include Hallel, which is the series of psalms that is said on Hallel is said on Sukkot, on Pesach, and on Shavuot. They are special celebratory psalms. But there, as I mentioned, there's also been controversy about the celebration of Yom Yerushalayim, because the settlement of Eastern Jerusalem and the claim of Jerusalem as the capital for the state of Israel is very controversial among the left wing and the Arab population of Jerusalem. So one of the celebrations marking Jerusalem Day is a youth parade which is known as the Dance of Flags, and it begins at Gan Sacher, which is the square of where the civil buildings are, I suppose you would call them, and it winds through the streets of Jerusalem, and it threads through the old city, and it ends with a gathering and a final prayer at the Western Wall. But that parade has been controversial, and there have been violent interactions reported between Israeli youth and Arab youth when that has happened. And so, of course, nothing in Israel happens without some sort of controversy, because we have been around for 5,782 years, and we have always been a controversial people. We have always been fraught with fighting, and not only infighting, but of course outfighting. And so why should this be any different, right? I should also mention to you that there is another Memorial Day, which Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stated, and it began with a ceremony in Jerusalem and it is a Memorial Day for Ethiopian Jews um, from the congregation known as Beta Yisrael, and this was uh, this memorial is to remember those Ethiopian Jews who sacrificed their lives in coming to Israel, who perished on their way to Israel. And in 2004, the Israeli government decided to turn that ceremony into a state ceremony, which is held at the memorial site for Ethiopian Jews who perished on their way to Israel. And that is that memorial site is at Mount Herzl, which is also considered like the national cemetery, where so many Israeli soldiers are also buried. And of course, Theodore Herzl is buried there, and many other of the early Israel's dignitaries. So, so that also takes place every year at around this time. And it's very interesting when you go to Israel now, and you see Ethiopian people. There is no difference between those who came, whose roots are in Ethiopia, and those whose roots are in the land of Israel. We're already talking about second, third, and fourth generation Ethiopian Jews from Beta Yisrael, and they all serve in the army. They all speak Hebrew, and of course, the initial immigration process was exceedingly difficult for them, for Israelis, but God willing, many of those knots have been untied. Although, unfortunately, in Israel, just like we experience here in the United States, there is racial discrimination. Even though these Ethiopian Jews have been living in Israel now for many decades, are part of the fabric and the culture of the Israeli society. So there is a day that commemorates their sacrifice too, as many children were airlifted and others lost their lives trying to cross the African deserts to get to the plains and to get to safety. Okay, that concludes our segment on the secular holidays and observances in the state of Israel, and those that were mandated by the government, the modern government, and those which are not biblical in nature, although may have some religious overtones, of course. Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, all of these observances have prayer services that are part and parcel of the celebration or the sad observance, but they are not old enough to have been in the Bible. And now we're going to get to those. And I'm going to speak now specifically of Purim and of Pesach. And I'm going to do all of that in about 25 minutes. So this is in no way going to be an in-depth discussion, but I wanted to do these two together because one comes in March and one comes in April. And then we will have finished the entire range of holidays that takes us through the end of April of this year, 5782. Okay, Purim. So most of us know this as a joyful, celebratory, festive holiday. This year, Purim starts on the evening of March 16th and goes through March 17th, nightfall, sunset. So there are actually several components to how Purim falls. The day before is known as the Fast of Esther, and single women are supposed to fast all day. The next day is Purim, and the following day is a day known as Shushan Purim. So the first day of Purim is celebrated on the 14th of Adar, but in Jerusalem and in all the ancient walled cities in Israel, the holiday is observed on the 15th of Adar. And that has to do with the edict sent out by King Ahasuerus. And I'll get to that in just a moment. So the Hebrew word Purim is plural, and it's actually from an Akkadian word, puru, which means lots, like lottery lots. And in those days, lots were probably stones or some sort of a piece of pottery or something that indicated if somebody was a winner or a loser or how their name was chosen at a given point in time. And the holiday commemorates, of course, the saving of the Jewish people from Haman, who was a Persian Empire official who was planning to kill all the Jews in the empire. And of course, this is all related in the book of Esther, the Megillat Esther, which dates back to around the 5th century before the Common Era. Now, there's a lot of controversy about whether or not this historical event is indeed historical. And we do know that there were attempts to eradicate the Jews from the Persian Empire, but whether or not it happened just as it's written in the Scroll of Esther is subject to a great deal of conversation, which is probably not the purview of this program this afternoon, but something that is would be interesting to discuss. Just so that you know, when we as Jews refer to the Megillah, we're usually talking about Megillat Esther, the Megillah of Esther. But the Megillah, the word Megillah simply means scroll. So the Torah is a Megillah. Anything that is read from a scroll form is a Megillah. The difference between the Megillat Esther and other Megillot, namely the others that I'll tell you about in a moment, is that the Megillah Esther is the only scroll other than the Torah that is actually still read from the scroll itself. All of the others are generally read from a codex, from a book, and I'll tell you about those in just a moment so that you know what is read when. The Torah, of course, is on 2 scrolls. The Megillat Esther traditionally is on 1 scroll, and it's a scroll like a wooden handle, usually in a very ornate single case, and the entire scroll wraps in, and the reading of it takes place by pulling out the entire thing, reading it, and rolling it in as you read it. So unlike the Torah, which goes from having everything on one of the eitzim, on one of the spindles, to eventually rolling it so that everything is on the other spindle by the time you get to the end of the book of Deuteronomy, this is on 1 spindle. You pull it out, you read the whole thing, and as you read, you roll it back into its case. Now, that in and of itself is different and maybe even a little bit comical when you watch it. So perhaps that gives us some sense of the feel of this holiday. In addition, so let me tell you about the other 4 scrolls, because we have 5 altogether. We have 5 Megillot. We have, and I hope I remember them because I'm doing this from memory, Megillat Esther, which is read at Purim. We have Megillat Ruth, which is the next one that will come. Actually, I lied. The next one that will come is Shir HaShirim, which is the Song of Songs, and that will be read at Passover, which is the next big holiday. Then we have Megillat Megillat Ruth, which is the book of Ruth, which is read at Shavuot, which falls this year in very early June. Then we don't read another one until sometime late summer, usually late July, early August, and that is Megillat Echa, the Book of Lamentations, which is read in at Tisha B'Av, very sad, mournful text. And then finally, the fifth one, which is Megillat Kohelet, which is the book of Ecclesiastes, which is read at Sukkot. So all of these 5 different Megillot, these 5 different scrolls, have their own specific holiday on which they are read. And so they correspond. Megillat Esther, of course, read at Purim, read twice, usually the Erev Purim and then the morning of Purim. And so it tells the story of this guy named Haman. He was a royal vizier to King Ahasuerus, who was known as Xerxes I of, or Artaxerxes I of Persia. And he had amassed massive amounts of land. It says that he owned 127 different provinces. He loved to drink wine, any other alcoholic beverage, and according to the Hebrew calendar, Purim is celebrated annually on the 14th of Adar because it celebrates the victory of the Jews over their enemies once again. And thank God we are still here standing today. And since the in cities at that time that were protected by a surrounding wall, like at the time of Joshua, Purim is celebrated on the 15th of the month of Adar on what is known as Shushan Purim, since the fighting in the walled city of Shushan continued through that day. So the walled cities celebrate on one day, on Shushan Purim, and the unwalled cities, those in the outskirts, celebrate on the 14th of Adar. Now, to further complicate matters, this year we have 2 months of Adar, and you probably know enough, and many of you know because I've talked about this before, and I'm sure you knew it from before I even spoke about it, that Purim, that Adar sometimes is observed, the month falls twice. So it's like having 2 Octobers or 2 Mays. And that is in order to recalculate the Hebrew calendar. We have what is known as a leap month, and Adar is that leap month. And this year, right now, we are in Adar 1, and we just had a full moon. So in 2 weeks, when we have a new moon, when there's only like a little skinny part of moon out there, a brand new moon, we will begin Adar 2. And when the phrase is, and I won't say it in the Hebrew, I'll say it in the English, when Adar comes in, joy and festivity begin. So you are commanded to be happy. You are commanded to provide gifts to the poor or to your friends. These are known as mishloach manot, which literally means to send gifts, because of the rejoicing that the Jews did, that they were not slaughtered. They were commanded to give gifts to one another. And you must listen to the Megillah being read. Sometimes I read the Megillah, sometimes we do a Purim spiel, but whatever you get, it will tell the story of Purim. So we know that the text tells us that King Ahasuerus was a male sexist, and he had a wife whose name was Vashti, who was a woman ahead of her time, who basically told him that no, she would not dance for him and his buddies, and as a result, he banished her, went off to look for a new queen, found this beautiful young thing by the name of Esther, which, by the way, is a Persian name, which is not unlikely that she would have a Persian name. The word means hidden one, and she indeed was hidden because Ahasuerus did not know that she was Jewish. She was kind of sent, it was like being sent for an audition by her uncle Mordecai, who thought that she would be a perfect queen and that by being in the palace, she would have insight and have access to inside information. And indeed, Mordecai finds out that there are two of the king's servants are plotting to kill him. He gives this news to Esther. She shares it with the king. The plot is foiled, and he says to her, I will give you anything and everything that you want because you saved my life. What is it that you want, Esther? Well, Esther, of course, at this point knows that she is, that her people are going to be killed because she knows about this edict that the king has put out there as a result of Haman's machinations. And so she begs him and says, let's have a banquet at which I will out Haman as this evil perpetrator of genocide. He will be brought low. My uncle Mordecai will become a hero. I will become a heroine. We will save the Jewish people together. And indeed, that is what happens. The plot is foiled. In those days, an edict that was put out by the king cannot be retracted. But what Ahasuerus did was he put out a second edict that now said that any of the Jews who were able to would be permitted to take up arms and to defend themselves. And defend themselves they did. Haman, of course, is hung. His 10 evil sons are hung. The Jews win again. We eat these little triangular shaped cookies known as Hamantaschen, which are either Haman's pockets or Haman's ears or Haman's hats, depending upon how you want to interpret that. And all is well and good in the land of Shushan, except for the fact that tens of thousands of people are slaughtered. So when we celebrate this holiday, and I use that word loosely, we are supposed to be joyful, we are supposed to be happy, and yet we also have to be cognizant of the fact that this was a bloody massacre. At least, perhaps not this specific account, but certainly there were battles like this that were fought and attempted massacres of the Jews that were fought. And so this may be a conglomeration of those stories in order to bring all of the disparate pieces together to basically say that the Jews survived once again. Now, what's interesting here, and I'm just going to give you a couple of more tidbits, is that, as I said, the primary source for the book of Esther, for the story of Purim, is in the book of Esther, which is in the last segment of the Hebrew Bible known as Ketuvim, which are the writings. And it's dated to around the 4th century of the Common Era, as I mentioned. According to the Talmud, it was redacted from by the Great Assembly, which was the original sages in Israel, from an original text by Mordecai. Now, I did not know that initially. So the tractate Megillah, which is in the Mishnah, records the laws according to Purim. And in the Gemara, which is the Talmud, we also get a record and additional contextual details, such as Queen Vashti having been the daughter of Belshazzar, as well as other details that we get from Josephus's writings about Esther, that she was actually of royal descent. She wasn't just some cute little Jewish maiden living out in the streets of Shushan with her uncle Mordecai. So there are all kinds of rabbinic and midrashic texts about the book of Esther. There are traditional historians that say this really happened. There are those that say that it is allegorical. It is more of a national than a religious holiday in nature. It is a biblical holiday, however, because it is written about in the Bible, in the book of Esther, and it isn't part of some writing that's outside of our Bible. It's not in the Torah, but it is in the Bible. So Hallel is not recited. So unlike the three pilgrimage festivals of Passover, of Shavuot, and of Sukkot, it is not Hallel, which is the Psalms of praise, are not recited. Okay, so we read the Megillah. We say a special prayer, Al Hanisim, which is also a prayer that we say on Hanukkah for the lighting of the menorah. And we also include, of course, Birkat Hamazon, which is the prayer that is said following meals. There are 4 main obligations. You have to listen to a public reading, usually in a synagogue, of the book of Esther. You have to send gifts of food to friends. You have to give charity to the poor. You must give charity to the poor. And you have to eat a festive meal, which is known as a seudat mitzvah. So the last 3, the sending of gifts to friends, the giving of charity to the poor, and the eating of a festive meal, only apply during the daytime hours of Purim. You don't eat the festive meal at night because you're supposed to be listening to the Megillah being read. Okay, so in Israel, I will tell you that on Purim, anything goes. It is raucous. It is loud, and it is celebratory. It is bright. When you go to the bakeries leading up to Purim, you can find every kind of hamantaschen you can imagine. And I don't just mean the sweet ones, I mean the savory ones too, and the ones filled with that are like knishes, and the ones filled with meat. Not in a dairy bakery, of course, but there are ones filled with meat, and there are those filled with every kind of sweet filling, from chocolate to Nutella to you name it. When you hear the Megillah being read, you can tell that it is different from listening to Torah or listening to Haftarah, because it is in a completely different melody. The trope marks that are used, meaning those little symbols over and under the syllables of the words in the Megillah, are the same. It's the same language of that the music is written in. It's just a different musicality. Does that make sense? So when you hear it being chanted, you understand better that this story is somewhat farcical. It is not to be taken literally. It is allegorical. And how do you know that? The way in which it's chanted, you can hear from the music that it is like the difference between listening to Gilbert and Sullivan and Mozart opera. Okay? There is just a whole different feel. And I have sworn that you cannot know a word of Hebrew, and you can listen to the Megillah being chanted well by somebody who really knows what they're doing, and you can almost tell exactly what's going on at any given point in the chanting of it, because the story comes through the music. And I've heard it chanted really well by cantors who really know what they're doing. And of course, every time Haman's name is mentioned, we are to blot out his name. He is an Amalek. In our recitation, he is the most evil of evil, along with Pharaoh, along with Amalek, along with Hitler, along with Mussolini, along with all of those ilk. and he is his name is to be blotted out. We're supposed to remember it, but at the same time, we're supposed to blot it out. And how do we do that? Through loud, raucous booing, through our groggers to make sound so that we don't hear his name, and so on. I am not going to be able to get to anything on Pesach today. I will take this up starting in, I'll work with Katie on getting some dates together for you, but I don't want to do it a disservice by rushing through it. And so there are a couple of really interesting things that I want to bring to light about Passover this year. And again, I don't want to give it short shrift, so I will do a live program for all of my beloved residents. And then the last thing I want to leave you with is the Megillah of Esther itself. The name Esther, as I mentioned, is Persian, and it means hidden one, the one who is hidden. And Esther was hidden from her not her persona, but her identity was hidden from the king. The king did not know until she finally acknowledged to him that she was Jewish. So that is one aspect of the hidden nature of Purim. The other aspect, however, is that there is another extremely important entity who is nowhere mentioned in the book of Esther, and that is God. So we are to assume God's presence. We are to assume that God was there with us, guiding Esther's hands and guiding Mordecai's hands and guiding the hands of the king to allow the Jews to defend themselves. However, we do not read God's name. There is no Adonai anywhere in the scroll. The Yud-He Vav-He is not existent, nor is the word Elohim or Eloheinu or any of the other monikers used for God. So God is also hidden from this text. As a result, women, at least in most Orthodox communities, including modern Orthodox communities, generally are not allowed to lead the Megillah reading. Orthodox communities generally say that it is a mitzvah for women, but that they should read it for themselves because there's an uncertainty as to which blessing they should recite when they're reading it. Nonetheless, they agree that women are obligated to hear it. However, what's very interesting is that because the Megillah Esther is a book about a woman heroine, women are permitted to write a scroll of Esther. It also is due to the fact that the name of God doesn't appear in it. So a woman is not creating a desecration by writing the name of God, which in traditional communities would be seen as a desecration. So a scroll of Esther may be written by a woman. Women are obligated to read the scroll, not in public necessarily, in a mixed multitude, but at least for themselves, or they're not supposed to be around men when it's being read, but they can read it for themselves, or they can read it in their groups with other women. Some modern Orthodox leaders have held that women can serve as public Megillah readers. And it's become a little more common among modern Orthodox Jews, though women may only read for other women, according to Ashkenazi authorities. And of course, interestingly enough, Esther was not an Ashkenazi Jew. She was a Sephardic Jew. She was a Persian Jew, which is current-day Iran. And so very, very interesting ins and outs of this holiday. And I'm excited to celebrate it with you. I have programs planned already for Wednesday, March 16th that will take place in Goldberg Healthcare Center as well as in the Katzen residence, and separate programs that will be held in assisted living as well as in independent living, and that will be part of your happy hours on that Thursday afternoon, March 17th. So we will get there. But for now, I want to say Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, my dear friends, my dear Chaverim, for joining me today. And we are open again for business, which is very exciting. La'at, little by little. At least the dining rooms are open now. I will be joining you live for blessings next week. Sorry they were recorded this week, but I had plans that took me out of town and was unable to do them live this Shabbat. But next week, we're back in business. I'm really looking forward to joining you all again. And thank you again, as I said, for joining me today. We will catch up on Passover soon, I promise you. Shabbat Shalom, and thank you for joining me. Bye-bye.